Good morning, everyone. We're apparently getting a late start here, and I don't actually know how that happened, but we are. Anyway, I'm Brian Rowan from the University of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's plenary session of the National Academy of Education meeting. Today's session is going to be about the measures of effective teaching study, which was one of the largest studies of teaching ever undertaken, certainly in the United States, I would venture to say in the world. What the aim of the session is today is to assess the contributions of this study to research on teaching, kind of fundamental contributions to research on teaching. And to do so, we have two researchers who played critical roles in the study, both in the design and in the execution of the study. Our first speaker today will be Tom Kane from Harvard University. And Tom's a professor of education and economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research. He directed the measures of effective teaching study for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Tom's work spans both K-12 and higher education and examines issues such as the design of school accountability systems, teacher recruitment and retention, financial aid for college, race-conscious college admissions, public financing of community colleges. And I've asked Tom to talk today about the contributions of the MET study to basic research on teaching. Our second speaker will be Dan McCaffrey from the Educational Testing Service. And Dan is a principal research scientist at ETS and one of the country's leading experts on the measurement of teaching effectiveness. He led RAND's efforts on the Measures of Effective Teaching project and was centrally engaged in data analysis, and has recently worked on many different studies that involve both the collection of value-added and observational measures of teaching effectiveness. And so I've asked Dan to talk today about basic issues in the measurement of teaching. And I'm Brian Rowan. I'm the third speaker. I am a professor of education and a research professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, and I was not involved in the design or execution of the MET study, but I did somehow become the person who ended up archiving and disseminating the data to people, which I find to be quite a challenge. And I want to talk today about public access to the MET data. I want to make you aware of how you can analyze and use these data in your own research or with your students. So the plan is for each presenter to talk for about 15 minutes, after which we'll open the session to a Q&A. So thank you. Tom?
So, okay. So I wanted to start out by just providing some of the background and the motivation for the project. And I just wanted to remind you where the debate stood 4 years ago when we started this project. So for decades, we'd had evidence that there were huge differences in student achievement gains in different teachers' classrooms. There was also evidence that the paper credentials, the kinds of information that's available at the time somebody is recruited, and I'm not just talking about whether or not somebody is credentialed as a teacher, I'm also talking about undergraduate institution, SAT scores, measures like that, predict very little of that variation in student achievement gains in different teachers' classrooms. And then third, almost everywhere, teacher evaluation was a perfunctory process. Now, it's almost as if we took the facts and then designed the world that is exactly 180 degrees contrary to what the facts would suggest. So rather, what the facts are saying is, hey, look, don't focus all of your policy efforts at trying to regulate the quality of teaching at the front end. What the facts are suggesting is really pay attention to the differences in performance that emerge on the job, yet we were doing none of that. We were doing just the opposite. Now, the other thing was that there were two very different research traditions that had very little to do with each other. There was a group of folks that were primarily interested in value-added measures who were suspicious of the practice-based measures, in particular classroom observations. Then there was another group of folks, and I'm not going to ask you which group many of you were in the anything but value-added group. And the obvious answer, by the way, is that, of course, you'd want to combine the measures, that you'd want to be looking both for evidence of student achievement gains and collect data on practice, and ideally what we tried to do is student surveys as well, and put together the various sources of information. Now, the problem was there was no data set or very few data sets that had multiple kinds of measures that would foster that kind of discussion. So I see Susan Moore Johnson is here. Susan, I don't know if you remember a discussion we had at a dinner hosted by the AFT a few years ago, but I remember you saying after a study that had come out from Cincinnati that where we showed in Cincinnati that classroom observations on the Danielson instrument were related to value added. I remember you saying, oh, that made me feel better about value added. And as I remember saying back to you, well, Susan, that study actually made me feel better about Danielson. And that's exactly what one of the aims of this project was, to create more space for trying to flesh out that middle ground which had not been fleshed out before. So just some of the design elements of the study. So first was size. There were close to 3,000 teachers the first year. There were two reasons why we went for such a large sample. Dan McCaffrey, I've lost Dan. Dan and Doug Stager had done some power calculations suggesting that, look, we weren't quite sure what magnitude correlations we were going to find. And so we wanted to we were actually originally shooting for a sample of 3,700 teachers to try to make sure that if there were relationships there, we would find them. But also, in the second year of the study, we were testing for bias, and we wanted to have a fairly tight estimate around the magnitude of the bias. The second reason why we went for such a large study was that the whole goal of this process was to inform how school districts implement teacher evaluations. And so if we had done 200 or 150 classes, we may have drawn the wrong conclusion that a well-trained research team could score reliably with 200 classrooms, as opposed to, no, school districts and states could do this well. So our goal explicitly was to say, how would these measures perform in a large scale? Not just, we weren't even interested in how well these measures perform if scored by the rubric developers and their graduate students. That's a separate question, but that wasn't the one we were interested in. We were interested in, could you transfer this knowledge of the rubrics on a large scale and apply it in classrooms? Because that's what would have to happen if teacher evaluation systems were going to be improved. So there were 44,000 students involved in year one. ETS trained more than 900 raters to score the videos. We had 22,500 video scores. And finally, we wanted to see how a principal who actually knows a teacher whether they could apply any of these rubrics appropriately. Because you might think these ETS raters who have no personal relationship, they might be seeing one set of things, but the principals who had just had an argument with the teacher in the faculty lounge or had just been to the teacher's wedding the week before might be distracted by some of that other information. And we wanted to see whether principals could apply the rubric as well. So we got 3,100 observations by principals and peers in Hillsborough, Tampa, Florida. Second, we wanted to compare a number of different instruments. So, and we quickly realized that even the Gates Foundation couldn't pay to have 5 different people walk through the back of every classroom. Instead, we said, hey, look, let's go out and collect video in these classrooms. And so Teachscape, our contractor in that, developed a video rig that didn't require like a camera crew and a boom mic. I don't know if that was in the prior studies of instruction that involved video, involved camera crews. As crazy as that sounds in terms of its general applicability. So we had these panoramic cameras that were developed. As I mentioned, we didn't want to bet on one classroom instrument, so we wanted to test 5 different ones. Student surveys. This is the way many of us are evaluated every semester. We wanted to see whether this could perform well in a K-12 space. We were working in grades 4 to 8, and then 9th grade, several different subjects: math, biology, algebra 1, biology, and ELA 1 in high school. But at the time we started this, my older boy was in 4th grade, and so I wasn't sure he was even aware of his teacher's gender. So 4th grade was the youngest grade we were willing to try the student surveys. And actually, I think we found that the student surveys work about as well in the younger grades as in the higher grades. We also wanted ETS developed a test of pedagogical content knowledge that we tried out. And we wanted to take seriously the worries that these state tests were measuring pretty crude levels of skills. So we did some supplemental assessments. In math, we used a balance assessment. In ELA, we used an open-ended version of the Stanford 9, where kids have to write short answer responses to the questions. Then in year 2, we had, or Dan could testify, in August between year 1 and year 2, we randomly assigned about 1,600 classrooms to different teachers within the same school. And the point of that was to try to answer the question, are we identifying causal effects of teachers? Now, those questions have been mostly raised in the context of value added, but they apply in equal force to the classroom observations and the student surveys. It may be easier to look good or to apply a particular set of practices in a classroom if you have a bunch of really engaged students. So the issue of bias and student sorting is always applied to value added, but it applies equally well to the student surveys and the classroom observations. And the only way for us to try to resolve that was to have random assignment in the second year and see whether the measures from the first year predicted student achievement following random assignment. Okay. Another aspect of this that was critical was that there was a policy window that was open, created by the Race to the Top. And we could have done the slow study, the study that if I had thought about it for more than a day or two what I would have done the slow study. But actually, the point was, I think that would have been a lot less relevant. It would have had a lot less impact, because we started planning this in the spring of 2009, when the Race to the Top competition was originally created. That's spring 2009. We knew, okay, if we're going to do this research study in time to influence anything that these states are going to do, we got to do it fast. We can't spend a year planning this. So we were recruiting teachers by September 2009. In fact, we closed recruitment in December of 2009. That was right when the Phase 1 winners were announced from Race to the Top. And we had the first report out on student surveys by the end of 2010. And then the second report on classroom observations a year later in January 2012. And then the final 3 reports came out in January 2013. This is important because many people have said, oh, wait a minute, like, why'd you use the tripod survey when, why didn't you take time to come up with a student survey that was aligned with the classroom observation instruments? The answer to that question is we didn't have time. We had to use the instruments that existed then, and even then it was unrealistic to try to get it done. But we had to use existing instruments, and we were testing existing instruments as they existed, not as we wanted them to be. Okay, so I'm just going to hit a few of the key findings. First, I think we learned some pretty sobering lessons about what kind of reliability you can expect when trying to use these instruments on a broad scale. That even with ETS-trained raters and a pretty serious certification process and a daily recalibration that ETS did, we found there were huge rater by teacher interactions. Weren't big rater effects. So it wasn't that some raters were consistently high and consistently low, but it was that when raters, even trained raters, saw the same video, they would often come up with different scores. And so and there was also a lot of lesson-to-lesson variation within the same teacher. So to generate reliabilities above 0.6 with the existing instruments on a broad scale requires at least 2 raters to at least get some power of the averaging across the rater effect, and multiple observations to see more than one lesson. Second, even though we were curious about whether any of these instruments really stood out as wildly different from the others, we found at least the 2 general pedagogical instruments that we tested, Framework for Teaching and Class, very highly correlated. In fact, once you adjust it for measurement error, essentially correlation of 1. The 2 other instruments, so we also looked at MQI, Mathematical Quality of Instruction, and Plato. So Pam Grossman was here last night. But those 2 are pretty highly correlated with the general pedagogical instruments. And most of these had 2, maybe 3 principal components. And when you look at the items underneath each of those components, many of the components look pretty similar across the instruments. Third, Tampa principals were able to rate about as reliably as the ETS-trained raters. That was news, because that says, hey, look, they were able to put out of their mind the faculty lounge discussions and the attending the teacher's wedding, and they were able to see the same things in the video that others were seeing. But they were also granting a big home field advantage in terms of a shift in the mean score for their own teachers. Reliability of student surveys. This was a bit of a surprise but in retrospect makes some sense that with the student surveys, you get power of averaging that you don't get, that's hard to get, it's expensive to get with the classroom observations. So rather than 1 or 2 trained adult observers, you get 25 kids in an elementary classroom, 75 to 100 kids maybe in middle schools. Now, I think we got to do a lot more work aligning these student surveys with the other classroom observation instruments, but I think we relearned something important about the power of averaging. And then random assignment validation. So all 3 types of measures on their own and in combination were able to predict student achievement following random assignment. In fact, like here's one of the graphs from the report. Each of these dots represents an average of 40 teachers, so there are 20 dots. So these results are for about 800 teachers in math classrooms. Along the x-axis is the predicted achievement using the teacher's past measures of effectiveness. The y-axis is their students' achievement following random assignment. The dotted line is the line at which actual would equal predicted, and it actually happens to be about the fitted line too. So the fitted slope is about 0.95. So what that's saying is each of those dots is 40 teachers. It's not saying that for each of the 40 these measures generated accurate predictions. It just meant that on average they averaged out to predict differences that were consistent with what you would have predicted. It's important. It's not just that there was information, but the information could generate valid predictions of what would happen following random assignment. Okay, so impact of the study. First, it's just a new conversation. So if you go back to 2008, nobody was talking about we've got to reinvent the way we do teacher evaluation. So, and that's reflected in the fact I just did a Factiva search and the number of U.S. newspaper stories mentioning the 2 words teacher evaluation. It was about 70 stories a year up through 2008. But by 2012, there were 1,700 stories about it. And you can see that the discussion has shifted in Mexico and Brazil, Chile, a number of other countries as well. Second, there's even increasing use of student surveys. So Massachusetts is going to be rolling a student survey out next year. Georgia, North Carolina. I think that actually will spread. It's one of these things that's got to be a historical accident. I don't know the name of the dean that proposed it for higher ed. Maybe somebody here knows, but maybe that person's name has been lost to history. But it seems like a historical accident that something that is ubiquitous in higher ed would not exist at all in K-12. And I think we're going to see in the next few years that change. Already there's been some revisions of some of these instruments underway. And I think that now there's more confidence that it is possible to provide feedback on the quality of instruction, as at least improve on the world where 98% of people were rated satisfactory. And hopefully one of the unexpected spin-offs from the project will be, I think, the increased use of video for professional growth in classrooms. So we're running a project this year we call Best Foot Forward, where we give the camera to teachers. We say, here are the standards. You collect 4 lessons that you're particularly proud of. You submit them. We'll train your principal to have a conversation with you based on those videos. I think that kind of application will be dramatically expanding. It gives a teacher a chance to see themselves teach. It's crazy that we've not been doing that so far. It's crazy that classroom observations are still largely in-person observations. Tell that to Tom Brady. No, you should only, don't watch the video. Just sit down at the end of each game and have a conversation. Or no, have a conversation once a year. That's the way to really improve. Okay. Now, one key misunderstanding that I just wanted to talk about was just to point out the obvious thing, which is that professional development, if it's effective, is adult behavior change. And as we know from any other adult behavior change effort, it doesn't happen without feedback. So one way to think about PD that we've been doing so far is like it's Weight Watchers without a bathroom scale or a mirror. Just think how effective that would be. If you had, it would just be meetings, which is what professional development has become in U.S. education. So the measures are not the development part, but they're a key part of the behavior change practice. In fact, I'd say it is a prerequisite of an effective professional development strategy, is some way to be able to provide regular feedback to teachers on whether or not they're achieving the things that are implicit in the standards. So I was talking at dinner last night with some of the folks that have gotten grants to work on the Measures of Effective Teaching Database next. And I was struck by the fact that we all have to live up to the fact that we are at the very beginning stages of this. It is stunning how primitive some of our current thinking is about what effective teaching looks like. It's because, those low reliabilities in the classroom observation instruments reflect that. We don't have deep theories reflected in measurement about how to provide guidance to teachers. That's a huge indictment, I think, of our field. And that hopefully over the next 5 or 10 years, if we take this on, the next version of a project like this will find that, hey, look, you can generate much better evidence of instructional differences and provide much richer feedback to teachers. And I hope that with the videos and with this group of young folks that are starting to work with the metadata, that process is already underway.
So, next speaker is Dan McCaffrey. We'll just have a three-way thing here where we all just clog up the space.
I'll attack the same spot.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So Ryan asked me to talk. He said, "Oh, this will be kind of informal. We won't have, big presentation." So I actually followed the rules, and I'm a rule follower in general. So I don't have. Oh, sorry. So I kind of prepared to sort of be a little bit more casual in my comments, and so I didn't have my comments kind of written down here, so I'm going to sit here and sort of look more informal, so please feel more informal. But I do have a few pictures to sort of pepper my talk. So recently I was driving home from Detroit back to Pittsburgh, and I was listening to a series of essays from the NPR program, This I Believe. It was originally a radio program in the 50s, and they resurrected it for a few years, I think about 10 years ago. And the idea was you would have, each person would get about 2 minutes to talk about their core beliefs, and then they'd say about what they believe. And as I was sort of sitting there thinking about this talk, I realized that this talk was becoming my This I Believe talk about teacher evaluations. But unfortunately, I'm not going to make the 2-minute cutoff. And as I thought about it, I really thought, and I contemplated things, and I thought about what I knew, and I thought, wow, I could probably take an entire day to talk about half of what could be said about teacher evaluations. But what I came down to is I really think there are 4 key points that I want to get out. And one is that instruction's mediocre, and there's sort of a lack of appreciation of this fact by educators. The other is that teachers matter, and the value added demonstrates that teacher affects learning, but that not all teachers are equally effective, but it only provides an incomplete picture of the teacher's contributions. The other one is that all the measures we use are error-prone, and these can be random errors or systematic errors. Or systematic errors mean that how the errors work are sort of related to characteristics we know about the students. And that measuring teachers and teaching is critical, but it must be done smartly. And I'm going to say, I think Edward Deming, who was a visionary, statistician, who revolutionized industry through quality control, I think he has some things to say about that, and so I'll try and bring those in. So now I'm going to dig into the clicker. I'm going to dig into each of those points. Okay, good. Just want to see about which way that works. I'm going to dig into each of these points kind of a little informally. So I'm going to start with this figure. And what this figure shows is basically this is data from the Understanding Teacher Quality Project, which has had some similar characteristics to MET in that we observed teachers. We also got value added on these teachers. We had about 450 middle school teachers in this study, and we measured them on multiple observation protocols. So we have scores over here from the Classroom Assessment Scoring System class, which is developed at the University of Virginia. And then over here we have Danielson. And so class is sort of three things they measure. Emotional support, which is kind of like sort of scaffolding for the students' learning. They have classroom organization, which is kind of what you would think it is, about behavioral management is a big component of that. And then instruction. And it's a 7-point scale. And what you can see is that they're doing pretty well in classroom management in our sample. They didn't do quite as well in MET, but again, this is replicated there, same thing. And they're doing pretty poorly here. This is sort of only, not really even above the midpoint on instruction. And they're doing sort of in the middle there on emotional support. Danielson only has 2. They have a classroom environment, which is both the kind of management and some of the emotional support kind of things. Roughly speaking, as Tom said, those things overlap a lot. And then instruction. And again, it's pretty poor too. It's barely getting above a 2. It sort of would be classified as sort of needs improvement by and large. And so what we're seeing is that instruction's doing pretty poorly in both those cases. But when we sort of ask teachers to tell us what they think they're doing. So this is from another, and those things replicate in both, they replicate in MET, they also replicate in another study we did where we looked at high school and middle school algebra teachers and then measured them on the class and also measured them with an algebra test, a pre and post test. And so then we asked those teachers, this is actually from that middle school and high school study, we asked them to rate themselves on dimensions that were parallel kind of to the class instrument. And we asked them what are areas of strength and what are areas of weakness. And what you can see here is that they're feeling their best strengths is their instruction. So they're feeling they're doing the best in the instruction, and they're feeling they're weakest on classroom management, sort of completely the opposite of what we see. And they're seeing them all as being pretty close together. The other thing that's really striking is there's sort of weak correlation over here and over here. So the teachers who think they're really good at classroom managers tend to be scored higher on our measures, and the teachers who think they're weak tend to be scored lower. Same with the emotional support kind of domain. there's no correlation here. The teachers who believe they're really good instructors are not the teachers we believe are good instructors. So teachers are really lacking in appreciation of, one, that they're not doing well as instructors, and they don't really even know who's what. And Tom kind of made this point as well. They don't really have a good appreciation, a good language, a good understanding of where we stand with instruction. All right. Okay. So we're sort of moving into an area now where we're thinking about teacher evaluation, moving into an area where instruction is low and there's really not a good appreciation for what it is. But that's not the whole story, right? We do know that teachers really do matter, that there really is lots of evidence that teachers differ on their value added, and how much they matter really can vary from different studies. You sort of get something, when you look kind of closely at it, it seems like summaries sort of indicate maybe 4 to 5% of the variance, more in math than on ELA generally. As much as 14% in some studies are saying of the student variance can be explained by their teachers. And that doesn't sound that large, but when you compare to other kinds of sources we look at, it's actually often one of the larger sources of things that can explain variance than almost any of the others. But I think that in of itself is kind of interesting, but some of the other more recent literature that's been coming out is even more compelling about how much teachers matter. There's been several recent studies that are showing that teachers predict students' long-term outcomes. So studies have shown where they took students randomized to teachers when they were young, and then looking at their outcomes as adults, they're seeing differences across those students depending on who their teachers were. They've taken studies where they've taken value added that the teachers had, students had of their teachers, and those are predicting students' long-term outcome. And things like income, the neighborhoods they live in, the amount of schooling they get. So things that we're really all, I think, agreed. That's what we wanted to know, that education improves. We're seeing that they can directly relate these to teachers. Very recently, Gary Chamberlain, an economist at Harvard, came out with a study that showed that teachers predict college outcomes, and that these differences, if you compare teachers who are good or bad, the difference can be as much as a 1 percentage point difference of whether or not students attend college. But what's really interesting in that study, from my perspective, is that he's also showed that if you rank them on value added, again, it differentiates, but it covers much less of the distance. So, only about much less than a quarter, less than 20% of it, I think, can be accounted for if you sort them by value added. So we know teachers matter. We know value added matters. We know that tells us about achievement. But that's not the whole story. There's more going on in teaching than just what we can learn about value added, but teachers do matter and they have long-term effects. We also know that value added differs depending on which test you look at, how you measure it. Those correlations are often evaluated on one test or another. I think in the MET study we did is about 40.4, that correlation. So again, it's telling us something, but it's an incomplete story about something that's really important, that teachers do make a difference. And you might say, well, is this all just bias? Is this just really all about who they're sorted to? But the evidence doesn't seem to be stacking up that way. And I was very skeptical of this, but I think even as a skeptic, I have to admit that the evidence is stacking up in a way that where they aren't showing that there's a lot of bias, right? Tom showed it in the MED study. We did randomization, and when you look at the randomization, what we learn about value added on a randomized class, when we learn in a sort of traditional mechanism, they line up really well. The economist Raj Chetty has done a couple of different things using data where he showed, you take value added and you say you could predict with a lot more variables than we usually have. Does that help? Nope, it doesn't change things. If you sort of look at where teachers leave a school and predict how much you would see a change in that school based on who left, based on the teacher's value added, you see that again lines up very well with value added. So we're seeing a lot of support that's suggesting that what we're learning here is not about bias, it's really about something that's associated with the teacher. And one of the big studies that sort of said there was bias, the Rothstein effect. This is economist Jesse Rothstein showed that you could predict student outcomes by their future teachers, and clearly a future teacher doesn't cause learning, right? Well, there's been a lot of theoretical evidence that's shown that test can fail in the sense that it can find bias when it doesn't exist. And I heard recently about a simulation study that sort of showed that failing to sort of find and sort of over-finding bias when it doesn't really exist is actually very common with this test. So that test, which has been sort of the evidence for bias, has been kind of discredited. So I think, the overall story as I take away is that value added really matters. It doesn't really appear, or teachers really matter. They do affect value added. They affect long-term outcomes. Value added isn't the whole story, and it's not just about bias. It really is about something else. But it's not like we don't have any errors, right? All these measures have error. And I think Tom really pointed that out with some of what he said. And it's, and we hear, I think, in literature a lot about the errors in value added, but the errors in observations are there too. And so when you look at how raters agree, when you look at, you take two raters and say how well do they agree, how well do they agree with the experts, you get agreement rates around 20 to 25%, maybe as high as 75%. So, pretty low agreement. It comes up with these low reliabilities. And you're getting sort of stronger agreement, again, on the classroom sort of management perspectives, not on the instruction. And again, supporting this idea that maybe what people know about instruction is less clear than what they know about management. But it's not willy-nilly. It's not like people don't say anything. And so I think this figure is kind of nice for sort of getting some sense of what it means to have rate or error. So what I've done is I've binned teachers up based on how the experts scored a video. And then I said, okay, now how do our raters look? And so what you can see is, so when the experts scored on the 2, our raters aren't sort of saying they're anywhere. They're by and large, they're saying most of them are around 2, but a lot of them give 3s and 2s and 3s. So it's like where there's signal in there, but it's not perfect signal. And when you're saying with a 4, we're sort of binned around 4, but we're not always at 4. It could be a 6, you could be there, but it's mostly in the middle. And same up here. If the expert says it's a 6, we're more likely to say it's a 6, but it could be kind of anywhere. And that's what it is. There's signal. And so as Tom said, if we average enough of this stuff together, we get a good measure on a teacher. And if we average across teachers, we get good measures about teaching in general. But any single observation is a pretty noisy measure. So there's also sort of a lot of talk about oops, I think I went the wrong way. So a lot of talk of there is measurement error and value added, and so we need to worry a lot about the error and value added, right? There's only a few students that each teacher teaches. There's variation that sort of exists at the classroom level, even above and beyond the fact they're just working with students, and those errors are pretty large. And so one of the sort of good ways to sort of demonstrate that error is what this is a caterpillar plot, as people call them, for obvious reasons. And you can see what we have is the circles are sort of estimates of value added, and the lines are sort of the error bars around them. So it's giving you some sense of how imprecise the measures are. And what's sort of striking here is that, by and large, if you sort of said which teachers are we really convinced are different from each other, there's some at the ends, but there's a lot in the middle where the error is kind of large enough we're not getting a really precise estimate of an individual teacher. Now, again, if we average some of this data across time, we can get a more precise estimate. But generally, there's a fair amount of error there. So in making a measure on an individual teacher, there's a lot of opportunity for errors. So clearly, there's traditional measurement error, and something we need to worry about. One of the things, though, when we talk about raters, is that the raters we were looking at, they were autonomous people. They didn't have any connections to the teachers, and they were doing this in a non-evaluative format. And we also found that when we asked principals to rate when they were training, that they had about the same error rate. So principals don't have information above and beyond what our raters have. And Tom pointed that out. They're sort of about equally reliable. But one of the things is when principals actually apply this in the field, they are not autonomous raters. They are people who are they're supervisors, building managers, instructional leaders, and people with jobs to get done. And in this context, they don't appear to make random errors. In the context of when they're actually doing evaluations, they appear to make a very purposive kind of systematic error. So what this shows is these are not the same samples, but I think it's a pretty good demonstration of the problem. So this side is what our raters found when we had our research study raters rated people on Danielson. What you can see when we rate them, about 76 would sort of be binned as what we would call in the needs improvement bin. When principals in the field did something in Georgia using their pilot study, using their Danielson-like study, so it's not exactly the same, so maybe these distributions shouldn't line up exactly. But what they find is 74% of their teachers are in the proficient, and some are even in the sort of very top category, and only 6% are down there in the needs improvement. So it's a complete shift up in the distribution when they're there. And now this isn't unique to education. These kinds of shifts up are well established in almost all fields where people are doing sort of performance measuring. This is some work Brian's been doing has informed me on some of that. So this is a problem that we have. But, and it makes sense. I mean, there's common sense. There's reasons why they would want to do this. And in some states, if you would be in the needs improvement, that would create lots of negative consequences for the system. The principal would have to do more work. The teacher would be at risk for being fired. They couldn't afford to get rid of 75% of their teachers in this kind of situation. So there's, incentives for them not to do this. But the problem is, we start off by sort of saying, look, instruction is weak. This is sort of saying instruction is a problem and teachers don't understand it. But if we give them this information, in what way is that going to tell them that this is where the problem is? So in some sense, there's a problem with using this and having this context because it's not providing the information they need. And it's information we all believe is important. Because there is evidence that if you sort of train the teachers to improve on these instructional practices, they can do it. And there's, a very limited but some evidence that not only can they do it, but their students improve as well. So, we do need to know what the truth is, and it could be useful. I was going to make some comments about SLOs, but I think I'm going to skip that because I don't want to talk forever, and there's nothing very good to say about those anyhow. So in summary, we do have psychometric problems. We can't really differentiate a lot of people, but there really is useful information, but we do have to worry, I think, a lot about the inflation of scores when these things are put in practice. And as I said, that's true in many fields. And in fact, what's even more striking there is that economic and management theory would predict that this is exactly what should happen. It's sort of, it's somewhat a rational response to the error that's there and the context in which they're working. But, and it's in other fields. But it does sort of say that it doesn't give us a lot of hope to expect that sort of having an evaluation system built on these things is really going to be a productive way to improve teaching and learning. Especially not when it's a system that's based sort of, if you go and you talk with the states and you hear what they're doing, their story's all about creating the performance measure. It's all about the measure and a little bit about some punitive things to do to people who are performing very poorly. There's nothing in their plans about specifically how are they going to use that data to improve teaching. It's all about creating the measure and sort of sorting out a few and identifying a few problems. But I believe we need to measure teachers and that teachers matter. And we know there exist shortcomings in their practice, and we have things that measure long-term things. So it's clear we want to create this data and we want to figure out how to use it. So whenever I start to think about these things, there was a paper written by a statistician a few years ago, Sharon Lohr, and what she did is she went back to the writings of Edward Deming and said, okay, in other contexts, how would they really apply to value added? And I find myself always going back to that paper. There's something I find very appealing about it. Someone who thought very hard and was very successful at bringing sort of things in to improve work. How would that really apply here? And in this time, I found the paper particularly insightful. So before I went back and read that work, I decided I would title my thoughts, "Can we evaluate our way to better teaching and learning?" And then I found some irony that one of the quotes that Sharon had from Deming was, "You cannot inspect quality into a product." It seemed to me that there was a pretty good parallel there, and I figured that I would know what Deming would say to answer to my question, that it would be no. Now maybe presuming I know what a giant in the field would say is dangerous, but it feels pretty good that he sort of nailed my thing. But I also found another quote of Deming's comments about the America 2000 report sort of uncannily relevant at this part. And the quote is, "What is wrong? Numerical goals accomplish nothing. Ranking and reward of individual people, schools, districts do not improve the system. Only the method is important. But what method? Unfortunately, these goals have been posted in schools, giving pupils a bad start in life, goals without method." And when I think of the way he described that, this sounds so much like when I hear these states talk about what they're doing. They're setting rewards and goals, but they really haven't talked at all about a method to improve the system. And they haven't really talked at all about what the system is. So, those are some sort of negatives that Deming has said, but does he have anything positive for us to take away? Something that sort of might suggest what we want to do. And he does have some positive plans. I mean, one of the things he emphasizes is focusing on the system, not on individual performers. He was very much against sort of focusing on individual performers. He also said something I thought was interesting. He said that if you measure people, you're going to create three groups. You're always going to find three groups. You're going to find a group of people who are out of scope on the low end, a big blob in the middle, and then it's people who are out of scope at the top. And he sort of recommends you don't differentiate the people in the middle, but you need to find ways to help to the people on either of the two extremes and kind of deal with them as special circumstances. Instead, we should be sort of looking for ways to improve systematic problems, because he says 94% of all problems are systematic and only 6% are the individuals. And, if you look at our data, what do we see? We see value added, a whole bunch we can't differentiate. We see that, it really seems to line up again with what we're seeing here and sort of suggest what we should be worrying about, that, we have some evidence that this is a system that's a problem, and we sort of know from that system that we should be focusing on improving instruction. We kind of even know what the system needs to do. And it's clear we want to use this, because any teacher who's consistently doing poorly on value added is a teacher who has a problem. And there's no denying that, and I don't think we can come up with anything we want to say about value added. We can find a few special cases, but if you have a teacher who's consistently doing there, that's a problem. We should deal with it. But by and large, I think we want to use these measures to direct our attention to the things that are sort of coming out at a sort of higher level. Oh, and here's a clicker.
So, through the exemplary efforts of both Tom and Dan, these data that were collected by the Gates Foundation under Tom's direction, and lots of work at Rand with the data, these data are now publicly available, mostly through the University of Michigan. So there's some lingo here that I need to just sort of explain to you about what we call the different portions of the data, and there is a portion of the study that we didn't really discuss. So Dan and Tom largely were discussing, or Tom in particular, what we might call the MET study, which was a 2-year study, as Tom described, and it followed the sets of teachers over 2 years and has the video data and the observations that are coded and the VAMs and so on. And we have put these data together under the term the MET Longitudinal Database at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, and you can, through the procedures I'm about to describe, access and use those data for secondary data analysis. In addition, the Foundation engaged in something called the MET Extension Project, which we call METX, and in this, a set of teachers from the larger original MET study agreed to be videotaped extensively. So about 350 teachers are going to have more than 40 or 50 video sessions. So whereas in the MET longitudinal database you have 4 videos, in this data set, smaller number, but an incredibly rich following of teachers over a fairly long time. This is a really unusual data collection. And we are going to make these MET extension videos available to the public under certain restricted use agreements through the Brandon Center Digital Archive. So what I want to do today, just as quick as I possibly can, is give you some orientation to how these things work. So I'll start with the MET Longitudinal Database, which is open for business right now. You can access the MET data at the website www.icpsr.umich.edu, and in there we have the quantitative and video data from years 1 and 2 of the MET study, plus an extensive amount of related data. So the student surveys are in there, the observation scores are in there, the videos themselves are in there, some district data are in there, some sub-studies of the MET study, I mean, on and on and on. But we created something we call the core files, which I would recommend you at least start with, which is more or less an integrated longitudinal set of data from the MET study. And that also is attached is the video data. So, I've tried my best to try to make it easy to get to these data, but ICPSR is a huge data archive, the world's largest social science data archive. So here's how you get to it, just a kind of brief to get through it. Land on the ICPSR homepage and type into the search thing MET LDB. And that will get you to the Measures of Effective Teaching project series. That's like the MET project series homepage. And click that little link there, and if you hit that link, you'll finally land on the MET data files, the current complete list of MET data files. And the easiest thing for you to begin access is to go to what the series number 2 there, the core files. I just recommend you start there. You probably won't end there, but you'll want to start there, okay? So let's say we go to those. Now what you get is a complete listing of all of the data sets. There is a user guide. I recommend anybody who try to get into this data begin with trying to get to the user guide. This is like an incredibly complex, multi-layered study, and you need a user's guide. Start with the user guide. But note that there's also codebooks available for every file, which are useful for research planning. They may not be exactly what you need, but there's code books sitting around, and you can get code books. Now, here's the rub on all of this. The MET data can only be accessed inside of a video data enclave. And, a data enclave formerly was you had to actually go to the site and access on their computers. Now you don't have to go anywhere, but you are in a data enclave, and I'll discuss some of the properties of this data enclave. But the first step in accessing the data is to make an application. And that application will involve a legal agreement between your institution and our institution that holds your institution legally responsible for your use of the data. And expect that to take a while, although we have systems for doing that. And once you get granted that, you go into this virtual data enclave. The virtual data enclave is really a desktop for you under the control of ICPSR. It's your ICPSR desktop. And you'll have to be doing all of your work inside of that desktop or data enclave. The data themselves never go outside of the system. You can keep them on your own personal desktop within the system, but you cannot pull them out to your computer. And the most annoying feature of this, I think, for our researchers is that the results, before they can be printed, need to be monitored for compliance, so we're not revealing who the subjects are. So there is some monitoring. It's a bit annoying, but it currently, given the consents in this study, that's the best that we could come up with for access. And the videos in the MET longitudinal database have to be searched by ID, but you can search them by the IDs and then you can pull up any video you want to watch. They will be streamed to you. You can't download them. You're in the video data enclave, or a different section of the same video data enclave. But they can be streamed. And the interesting part of it is that while you're viewing these through the streaming device, you can be working outside the video data enclave, coding them with any system you wish. And you can enter your coded data back into the video data enclave, into your desktop. So the notion here is that what we have is an incredibly rich set of videos with a large amount of data on teachers and other observation protocols, so that if you're interested in developing an observation protocol, you can do a ton of development work, validation work using this data set. So that's the MET longitudinal database, briefly how to get to it. Then there's the MET extension portion of the dissemination effort. You will access this part of it through the Brandon Digital Center archive beginning in January. So this is not yet open. It's open for use, and if you're really, really eager to get going, you can sort of work a deal with us. But in January, the thing will be open for everybody. The website homepage to access this is www.brandoncenter.soe.umich.edu. And the collection will include, ultimately, about 40 to 50 video records for each of 300 teachers spread across these various grades that Tom was talking about and at the various years. Again, these videos are streamed. They cannot be downloaded. And an interesting feature of these videos is that they are tagged for search, and you can clip them and you can view them through a set of collaboration tools developed by a company called Zaption, which Jim Stigler and his son developed. So just some orientation. First step is you get to the MEDX homepage at the Brandon Center using the little website I gave you, and we're trying, this is a site that's still in development and hasn't received wide use, but we're trying to get people to understand how to use this set of video resources. So the first page is a lot of information just about how the hell to use the thing. And there's multiple ways to use it. The second is you actually get to the collection page. This has all of the MET videos. They can be searched by various tags and be brought up for viewing. So let's say you want to look at the tags are grade, subject, Common Core state standards that were being taught during the lesson, and a set of teaching behaviors that you might or might not be interested in that were developed by Deborah Ball and her colleagues at TeachingWorks. So there's a little funnel up there at the top. You hit that, and it's a drop-down box, and you can sort of check what kind of videos you want to look at as the search process will come, and those videos will appear down here in your playlist. You can then move any video you want over into the Zaption system. And the Zaption system is a set of collaboration tools. So we're showing, in this case, stitched video. The camera, by the way, in the MEDX is different from the MET camera, and I like to think a little bit better. And the audio is certainly better. But we've put together a stitched video. You have the classroom view and a board view, and they're always appearing together. And you can, so then you play the video. At any point you can stop. You can use, you can insert, various kinds of questions or comments that, like if you're teaching, you could have the students give them a prompt, have them write an answer, and that could be collected. You can clip at any point. You can mark at any point. So the notion is that these are videos that are intended to be used actively in groups for collaboration. In addition to, you can, through a more arcane process or like a more difficult process, link these data back to the original MET data, but then you have to go back into the old video enclave of ICPSR. So some caveats about this. These systems are still under development, and they're certainly going to become more user-friendly through use and feedback. So, don't expect perfection when you hit them, because we're still developing the systems. The video data enclave is continuously adding software. It's really quite interesting that education researchers use a different set of software than do the standard social science researcher. And so we're just always adding software. Like, I need this, okay? And we're also adding servers. There's a few psychometricians sitting in this room who know that the amount of computing required to do some of these really complex psychometric models is more than your desktop can generally handle. And so we have big server problems if lots of you guys get on at once. So we're balancing all those issues out. The MEDX site is actually upgrading itself now for user education functions. We're still working on that. The other thing to know is the holdings, both in the MEDX longitudinal database and in the MEDX or Brandon Center holdings, are dynamic. So we're still receiving data from RAND and for the MED study, quantitative data. And there's a process of reconsent going on so that more and more videos will be added over time. And the MEDX video collection is still being tagged, so it's relatively incomplete, but we're hoping by the end of this year we'll be fully tagged and ready to go. And then I guess the final caveat is that these data are very sensitive, you can imagine, and so we're really lucky to have them available to us as a research community, but they must be used responsibly. And the most restrictive data come from the MET study that Tom conducted because, there's just a ton of really sensitive data in there. Teacher personnel records, their value-added measures, and the consents were not written for you to be showing these to everybody. And so the video data enclave is the most restrictive place to do work, but on the other hand, it's a place where lots of people will want to go because that's where you'll find data that you really want to dig into. The MEDX holdings are under a different set of constraints or consents, and so can be used much more widely, but are still streamed only. You can't download these things onto your file, and you have to go through an educational process about what's a responsible use before we will grant you permission for these. And so permissions are needed for both data. Let's see, milestones. So, we've already got a group of users out there, the early career grantees, the MET Early Career Grantee Program sponsored here by the National Academy, and our members, our awardees are here today, have been using the MET LDB since April. If you're interested in what it's like to use the VDE, they're good. They were our guinea pigs and can give you some good tips about how to work through it. But the MET-LDB data right now are available to anybody, so if you want to just go to that website and start getting in, or you want to tell your students to get into that website, this is available for use. In addition, AERA, I'm pretty sure hasn't, but very shortly will, be opening a predoctoral competition, a predoctoral grantee program for use, secondary analysis of the MET data. So for those of you with doctoral students, keep your eyes open for that because that's going to be another source of money attempting to get people to use this. And the MEDX data are now in a pilot phase, but by January will be open to the public. So I'm just going to stop there. And let's have our two speakers come back, and got about 10 minutes or so. I open the floor for conversation. If people tolerate, maybe I'll go over time.
Thanks to all three of you for a really balanced and informative and helpful conversation about issues that have become more charged than they need have become charged. A question that I could invite a very detailed answer, but I'm hoping for a less detailed answer, would be whether you could say a bit about the strengths and weaknesses of alternative value-added models. We talk about value-added as one thing, but of course there's a host of decisions that go into choices of covariates and methods of adjustment and shrinkage and whatnot, how much data, background data is used, how far back it goes. And I'd appreciate your insights on whether there really are clear differences between the stronger and the weaker models, and also, of course, the extent to which the whole business is indicted on the basis of results from models that nobody should be using.
So I'll say four things. First of all, so the main model that we were testing was a model that Doug and I and Dan have been using in other contexts, where we control for prior year achievement, just 1 year. Actually, other studies have shown it doesn't make much difference whether you use more than 1 year of prior achievement as control variables. We also control for race, ethnicity, participation status, and we control for peer effects. In the final report, where peer effects are the mean characteristics of the other students in the classroom, which we've been using, but not a lot of the state models have been using. Now, there were some surprising findings in the final report. So, one, it's absolutely necessary to condition on the baseline test scores, just given the amount of sorting based on baseline test scores. But the evidence and the other, so that wasn't a surprise. But another thing that wasn't a big surprise based on other things we knew, which was you couldn't, there wasn't a lot of definitive evidence on whether or not controlling for race, ethnicity, and participation status was necessary to avoid bias. Because remember, we had a powerful opportunity to test different value-added models because we could see which value-added models most were able to predict what happened following random assignment. We couldn't resolve the question of whether or not race, ethnicity, or free or reduced price lunch status were necessary to control for. And we sort of knew we weren't going to be able to answer that because we knew from other studies that conditioning on those things or not conditioning on those things, as long as you're conditioning on baseline test scores, doesn't make much difference. It's hard to distinguish the teacher effect models that just have baseline test scores from those that have baseline test scores and race, ethnicity, participation status. Wasn't much power in that test because there's not a ton of variation. So another way of saying that is it's not worth having that argument because those two things are really highly correlated. A surprise was that the component that we took out when we conditioned on peer characteristics, which is something we had been doing, turns out is predictive of student achievement following random assignment. So we took out something we shouldn't have took out. And so I've gone back to just the really stripped down basic model, baseline test scores with or without the race, ethnicity, and so forth. Now that was a within school test. Right. The between school test might have given you a different answer because we were only randomly assigning within school. So that's why in the report we didn't come down on a really strong statement you should totally ignore the peer effects. Because we didn't test whether the peer effects might matter more for the between school comparison. Second thing I want to say is shrinkage is critical. So all of, at least for trying to generate accurate predictions of what will happen following, random assignment. So now, if everybody has the same number of years of value added or the same number of students in the class or close to the same number of students in the classroom, shrinkage is not going to do anything to change the relative ranking. But if there is a system where some teachers will have 1 year, some have 2 or 3 years, some are small classes, some are big classes, I think shrinkage we'd be recommending shrinkage to deal with. So an empirical Bayes kind of approach there. The third thing I wanted to mention was that we found, as everybody else has found, wider variance in teacher effects in math than in English language arts. Now, I'd gotten sort of used to that finding, and I'd been telling myself in the back of my mind, oh, that's because that's just telling us that teachers have less of an effect in literacy than they do in math. Other things outside the school are driving more of the literacy things. Now, we've actually not tested this yet. We need to. But one hypothesis is that we developed over the course of the project was that actually the non-experimental variation, the teacher effects on the open-ended literacy assessment looked a lot more in terms of magnitude like the math effects. Now, so I wonder whether this finding that has become sort of common knowledge that wider variance in teacher effects in math than in ELA is just a reflection of the nature of the state ELA tests, which are now mostly multiple choice questions of reading comprehension. But outside of grades 1 through 3, English language arts teachers mostly aren't teaching reading comprehension. They're teaching writing. They're teaching, analysis of different genres. They're teaching a different set of skills. So if we had assessments that looked more like those skills in ELA in particular, we might see more variance. Now, the reason why I said we could test it is that we've not done was, could we take the non-experimental value-added estimates from the first year on the supplemental assessment, and do those predict student achievement following random assignment on the supplemental assessment? There's some issues with why we didn't do that, but it'd still be worth at least testing, at least trying.
Yeah. So I want to follow up because I think Tom and I are I'm not quite as optimistic about Tom that the model and that a simple model is exactly the right thing. So this picture is a little complicated, but what we have here is the correlation. The y-axis is the correlation between value added and the prior year achievement of the teacher's cohort from the year before we estimated value added. So we estimate value added in 2010, and this is the incoming achievement of the teacher students in 2009, or maybe it's 2011. But it's a different cohort of students and their incoming achievement. And each point is a value added model. So this model starts with, these are math scores. So this one starts with just the prior year math score. The top line is we don't make any adjustment for measurement error. The bottom line, we make adjustment for measurement error. And so what you see is when we control for just a single math score, we get really high correlation between value added and the average achievement of the previous cohort. So those kids aren't using the value added at all, but they're sort of consistent. And as we add more things, so this is reading from the prior year, then we had language, then we had science, then we had math from the prior year. As we keep adding more tests, that correlation is going down. So we're just sort of pulling out more residual error, and that residual error is something that's sort of winding up creating extra correlation with who the teacher teaches. And if we account for measurement error, we do even better. So I haven't been able to sort of completely rectify this with the results from the Met study, which really suggests that we shouldn't have seen this. Now, but this is not restricted within schools and anything like that. So it's possible that, maybe when you constrain yourself within schools, some of what's picking up here isn't there. So it still needs to be looked at. But I think there is a reason to sort of worry about using better models. And, it doesn't cost really much to have a better model. So it seems to me like if I was going to do something, I'd take the insurance of having a better model, even if I couldn't say convincingly I need it. I'm not convinced I would pay enough price not to want to do it.
This was Susan Moore Johnson. This is a really great presentation, and I've read this material and heard people talk about it, and I thought it was really helpful. I guess as a group of researchers, we have to keep thinking carefully about where this goes for schools and kids and practice and policy. And The window of opportunity that you talked about, Tom, was very real, and was a great opportunity, but it also coincided with policies that happened very, very quickly as people jumped through the window, is what I kind of see, and fell very far. So you have policies in states like New York that suddenly everyone's going to be evaluated by their principal. Suddenly 40% of their evaluations is going to be based on student achievement. And as you know, huge numbers of the teachers had no good tests to rely on for 20%. And so then there's enormous amount of energy put into developing these alternative assessments, only to have Bill Gates tell us in the Washington Post, I think it was, that that's not really what we meant. So there's all this activity and focus, which has really directed attention to individuals, to assessment that's meant to dismiss people. And I know this isn't what is part of the plan, but it's how people have picked it up and are acting in it. I'm following the Massachusetts implementation quite closely. I think it was a good policy in many, many ways. But when you talk to people who are, ramping it up and rolling it out, it's all about principles. There's no awareness of this 2 observers, 4+ observations. The other thing is that I think that the work on the videos with individual teachers is really, it's great for people to be able to do that. But I'm really glad that, Dan, that you raised Deming, because Deming would not say you improve all this by focusing on individuals. This is an organizational issue, and that support has to come as a result of these assessments that will really inform the growth of individuals. So I guess what I'd really be interested in is you're looking ahead and saying, all that we've learned, and knowing the inclination of policymakers and practitioners to jump on the single answer, student surveys everywhere, or whatever it is, how can we as researchers help inform and influence the responsible use of all that you know about?
So I think one thing we need to do is take a step back and realize part of the reason why we're here is because we've ignored the evidence for 40 years that teachers matter. And so we ended up with a system where our existing evaluations were just absolutely perfunctory and useless. And so it's inevitable that when you try to change that, it's going to feel like a whirlwind, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that's not done well. But I think if we're patient, there is a framework in place now that will allow for improvement. I mean, the part of it that I'm most excited about, like the piece that I feel like if we can get this right, it will spread like wildfire and make a really big difference in the way classroom observations get done. And it's related to the point Dan made about how principals have a hard time applying the instrument to their own teachers. That's related to the home field advantage that we saw in Hillsborough. Video can change all of that. That if a principal is having a hard time being honest with their own teachers, then having somebody who doesn't have a personal relationship involved add to the feedback could actually make it easier for the principal to have a more honest conversation. That we do this in higher ed, by the way. So when just imagine the higher education tenure process if there were no such thing as outside letters. You'd get exactly the kind of inflation, everybody's exemplary, that you see in schools where the principal is doing the observation. There's no outside voice. So this Best Foot Forward project, where where is, I think, the way we will see video expand. In fact, I think it's the only way we see video expand. So there's so many potential advantages to using video for observation. But if you went to Michael Mulgrew in New York and said, I've got this great idea, we're going to put cameras in every classroom, it's not going to go anywhere. But the concept behind Best Foot Forward is, no, we're not just going to stick a camera on the wall. We're going to give the camera to a teacher. We're going to say, when you have 4 lessons that you're particularly proud of, you submit them. Then that would facilitate having external observers involved in the conversation, would actually give a teacher and a principal something to watch and discuss. You know, I think in the reference to Deming, I think the system failure is that we cannot be very articulate about what great teaching is, and that we're not providing any feedback to people. That's the system failure. Now, but I think fixing the system does involve individuals, because otherwise I think we end up with Weight Watchers without a bathroom scale. Like, everybody will sit around and say, oh yeah, I do that. So we've got to become much more articulate about what great teaching is. We have to develop more tools to make it easier for principals and teachers to have honest conversations. And I do think that the framework has been laid for us to begin improving the tools that states are rolling out in a not so great way right now. But I think there's lots of room for improvement. So that should be exciting for us, because we can develop the next set of rubrics. We can help, train people to do this better.
One of the things that the MEDEX video collection does is provide an opportunity for people to learn how to observe teaching. And so we have groups of first-time users who are working with principals because, it seems apparent to me from all the data that both Dan and Tom showed and the stuff we see in Michigan that there's a bunch of biases that principals go into when they look at this. First, there's a leniency bias, which is what we're talking about, the home field advantage. Everybody is, at the top, but not when we look at them. I mean, I don't know how many of you have sat around with teacher educators watching videos, but they are rarely saying this is an exemplary lesson. Second, they tend, in a lot of the instruments that are being used in Michigan, they can choose what dimensions to rate. So, and what you find is that they're always rating classroom management and really rarely rating instructional quality, particularly instruction challenge. They just think that's sort of not relevant, And so I think, just to begin, I agree with Tom's thing that video can be used extremely productively. We have lots of evidence to promote real conversations about teaching that's your teaching, but as a beginning, I think that we can begin to use these video collections to infuse them into, for example, leadership programs or to have districts work together to calibrate their scoring under the guidance of people who know how to use these things. So we have a long way to go, but we have a lot of resources because of the video. So I'll just... Yeah, you need the mic.
I guess one thing, following on Susan's question, that I at least would like to both say and then be corrected if I'm wrong, is that it's not inherent in any of these data this has to all be about teacher evaluation. For me, as someone interested in research on teaching, which is what Brian started with, and research on teacher learning, absent from our conversation so far is any theory about how people begin to learn to do teaching. So Tom, you keep talking about teachers, but for some of us here, this is about learning to become more articulate about teaching, and not just great teaching, but the work. And these data, in both of these data sets, to my mind, are opportunities for us to look across a rather large section of a non-random sample, but an interesting sample of American teaching. And I at least would urge that we not tie all of this. I agree with the policy issues, but
there are a lot of things to be done here that could, in the long run, also improve our theories about how people learn to do the work. The idea that people will improve their teaching simply by having more honest conversations strikes me as very limited.
No.
And this, can I just finish? So there are many things people have to learn to do in that space, like what you say in Weight Watchers, you have to get weighed, but people don't lose weight or change their eating habits just by getting weighed every week. It helps, but they learn a lot of things about what kinds of foods matter and how much to eat. They learn about they learn a lot of things. And where we're lacking here, where the failure of the system is no system for preparing people to start teaching that is actually about the work, and a system that goes on being a conversation about sorting people. So I'm just arguing that these data, as I understand them, and for my own work on the MedX work, does not suggest to me that the primary use has to be about teacher evaluation, but rather improving our ability as a field to be far more clear and specific and have much more common language for details about teaching than we've had before. But that's without any disagreement with Susan. I've spent a lot of my time in the last 2 years on teacher evaluation in Michigan, so I agree with everything Susan said. But these data could allow us to do some other kinds of work as a field, which we've not done. So if I'm wrong about that and the weight uses of these data, I would like someone to tell me.
So you misheard me, Deborah. I clearly said that we tested, the whole point of this exercise was to test our current thinking about what excellent teaching is. It wasn't just for watching the videos. We watched the videos and we scored them using the existing rubrics, which are the field's current understanding about what effective teaching looks like. And the whole point of this, which I said right at the end, is we've got to use these videos to develop the next round of instruments and rubrics to be much more articulate about what great teaching looks like. And Deborah, I don't think the part we have missed is that I think we're thinking that if we have great conversations about what great teaching looks like, and if we just talk about it in large professional development meetings, people will be able to enact those practices. That's not going to happen. And so the point is, the point is that we have to do both. That we have to be more articulate ourselves about what great teaching is. We need to develop instruments that will allow principals and teachers to be equally articulate about what great teaching is. And we have to be able to provide feedback to teachers on whether or not they're enacting those. Because, like, the point about Weight Watchers, I never said, Deborah, I never said the whole point was weighing people. I see your hand up. So
I didn't mean that you immediately skip to great teaching. The work, for those of us who both do teaching and teach people teaching, lacking is a vocabulary, I know you're partly saying this, a vocabulary for actually unpacking things like leading a discussion or explaining a concept to students or getting students to work in small groups or attending to the interesting work we heard yesterday about positioning. We need work on that. You don't skip instantly to what great teaching is. It's what's the work and what's involved in pulling it off is a slightly different point than you're making.
So if that is reflected in observable behaviors, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Deborah, so you're mishearing me. But I disagree with you that it's not about feedback, that it's not about being able to tell people that and that the weighing is a critical part of the process. And if we think it's not, we're kidding ourselves.
Up, as you can tell, but we have to move on. Sorry, Fred, but we're going to have to move on. I know that Tom and Dan will be around. I know many of us are eager. We could have this conversation all day, but unfortunately we didn't schedule it for all day. And so I'm going to adjourn us to a break. Our colleagues are available for conversation with you, and I know we'll be available throughout the break and even beyond, so please feel free. And thanks again.
We'd like to begin. If you could take your seats, please.